Good afternoon, everybody. This is John, Positive Pen, and I'm excited to bring my next guest. I call her Deborah, but she and I started to touch base I don't know, maybe a year ago, and we were corresponding back and forth. And some of the things that I was dealing with was some of the obviously my children's stuff that I was working through, kind of figure that out. And I actually bought some of her books. They're all about teenage trauma and gaslighting, which I really wanted to understand more about that from that perspective on how do I manage these kids who are, have been gaslighted so many years, and how do I approach that? So no further ado, I'm going to bring in Deborah. Hey, how are you doing? So did I miss anything there?
Yeah, those are the two books I've got out right now.
Okay, cool. So explain a little bit about who you are, and let's start with that first, and we'll start diving into the rest of the stuff, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I am a trauma therapist. I've been working in the field of trauma therapy for about 20 years now. First with foster youth and children who were designated severely emotionally disturbed, which is such a heavy label because really what it is the intense amounts of trauma they've been through in inpatient and outpatient settings. And then I started my private practice in 2010. Alongside that, I've done work in a safe house for victims of trafficking and a lot of advocacy work along with that. And I've also done a lot of contract work for survivors of mass shootings when that happened in our county. And then it became a very unexpected subspecialty where I ended up working with survivors from multiple other mass shootings and then conducting research on that as well. That was awarded a grant from the EMDR Research Institute. I'm also an EMDR clinician and a brain spotting. I'm certified both of those specialties, which are just fantastic ways to work through trauma.
So what got you into that line of work? What was we just happened to stumble in, or you just kind of like, well, I'm going to start doing this and see where it goes?
I've heard somebody say there's no trauma therapist who doesn't have a history of trauma. And I'm like, well, that's validating. And it makes sense because the reality is, you do look in the face of evil every day, constantly. I've been reflecting even just this morning about the things coming out in the Epstein files, and people are just blown away. And I don't know about other trauma therapists, but I'm just sitting here going, yeah, I've seen that in my practice. And realizing like maybe I'm kind of too jaded. Not that there's not compassion, but it's we do see hard things. And so I think there's something has to compel you into that. So to circle back to your question, what brought me there? I'll tell you the story I usually give, and then maybe I'll be a little bit more authentic and go deeper than that. But the story I usually give starts when I was about 21 or so, and I was volunteering with a youth organization. And there is a teenager who was in an abusive relationship, a physically abusive relationship, and she was suicidal and made some very lethal attempts. And here I am at 21. And I just I do not know. I had started out studying theater in university. So, and then I didn't finish that because I didn't have the money to continue on. And so anyways, even if I had a 4-year degree in theater, that would not have helped me with this teenager. And I just was like, I'm out of my depth. So that's when I started taking courses in psychology and crisis counseling and adolescent psychology. And I thought, oh, this could really help. Because I'd had this bias in my mind before that psychology was just a way of manipulating people. And I was not interested in that. But I'm like, I see how this could actually be really helpful. And so then I dove deeper into that and went on to get a bachelor's in human development and a master's in marriage, family, child therapy, and eventually a doctorate in clinical psychology.
Gotcha. So we also figured out we're Canadians. And
both
from
Western
the same Yeah, Western Canadians. That's important to distinct ourselves from the eastern part of the world there.
We love them too. We're just different.
Very different.
The green hippie province.
So you're doing your clinical practice in West Coast. LA area. Is that what I'm understanding? Okay, so um, now in that region, how like is it just kind of like are teenagers kind of gaslighted that much? And where are this gaslighting coming from? Is it from parents, social media? Where is it all? Because as a father or as a mother, how do you navigate this world of manipulation and
Yeah.
bulliness, stuff like that?
Yeah. Um, Before I answer, I want to clarify that the gaslighting book isn't just for teenagers, it's an all ages book,
Oh
which
yeah,
you
yeah,
don't read it. But
yes.
so really, like, yeah, teenagers are gaslit often by parents, as well as peers and boyfriends, and the emotional immaturity that comes with early relationships. Often we resort to manipulation when we don't know how to handle complex situations. That's the most benign um, reason for gaslighting, which gaslighting is a form of emotional, verbal, psychological abuse, where it's you're trying to control somebody else for your own gain. Um, yeah, and then but people do experience gaslighting across the lifespan, often in domestic relationships with a partner or spouse, sometimes in the workplace, and often in religious circumstances. With any high control kind of situation, the gaslighting, like I said, it's about maintaining control. So if you think about structures where somebody wants to be in control, in charge, and is not respecting you really as a person, your rights, that's where you're going to see it show up.
So, you know, I didn't realize because you're in relationships and you don't understand the red flags, obviously.
Mhm.
But I guess the reality comes from how you were raised and how your parents treat you. And some of the realization came to like a couple years ago, and I'm like, oh, that was a big boom in the head. And then
Mm.
I kind of like backtracked some of the things, and I started understanding where all that stuff was coming from. The gaslight and the manipulations, and kind of like going through there. I mean, when you're dealing with the children, and I'm wondering, how do they like? Obviously, their maturity level is not there enough to understand, especially when they're 20s, early 20s, maybe. Like, how do they how do they register that what was happening to them wasn't good, but also rather than blaming themselves or blaming the world, and I don't want them to blame their other where that comes from, but how do they understand that? How do they process it? Like what when does it trigger for a child to understand that what was happening? Sorry,
You
lost.
know, yeah, there's a few questions there. Like, absolutely, you're correct that, we miss red flags when we've experienced gaslighting throughout life. If you've experienced this with your parents, you're more likely to become involved in a romantic relationship later, or any other kind of relationship that mimics those dynamics, because you don't see the red flags, because they're not red flags to you. Your experience is normal because that's what normal was. And we grow up believing that our parents love us, and hopefully that's true. But our parents' love is often muddied and imperfect and complicated. And so, what we're told love is the model we follow. And then we end up in that same dynamic later, because that's just the way love is. Sometimes people are controlling because they're jealous because they love me, we think, or they just want to be with me all the time because they love me, instead of realizing that that's really about them. How do you recognize when you've been gaslit, especially when you've grown up in it? I think that was the crux of your question as well.
Yeah.
Um, it's hard to recognize without something to compare it to. So when you start to see a different model of what healthy dynamics can look like, then you might start to question, like, well, what was going on there, that maybe I didn't have to feel that way. Some people start to recognize it in therapy as they start to unpack their experience, or have that sense of, you know, I remember this, but my family says we were a wonderful, happy family. So why do I feel that way? So then you're left with this double bind of, either I'm broken and maybe psychotic or something, or my family really is problematic. And you have to make this really hard choice to kind of internally, it feels like internally betraying your family of origin, or choosing to be authentic to yourself, which is a really hard place to come through. And that's really why I think the gaslighting, I hope the gaslighting book is helpful to people, is because that becomes a barrier to growth when you have the sense of either I'm crazy or my family is imperfect, and you have to choose. And then we choose what's easiest, which is the status quo. Then we block ourselves from actually unpacking the pain of the past that's keeping us anchored down in the present. So maybe for some people, reading a book like that can be a helpful way to say, oh yeah, I've got like all these checklists in the book too that talk about, like, there's a is it gaslighting checklist, and I may have that as a free download on my website. I might have just taken it off like a few weeks ago. I'm not sure, but if somebody wants it, you write to me, I can send you a PDF or buy the book and it's in there. But that's just a one-page checklist, but there's all chapters too, talking about like, what are the cycles of gaslighting? What are some of the tactics of gaslighters? And when you start to go through and go, oh my goodness, this defines my relationship with my mom, or with my boyfriend, or with my youth pastor, or whomever it was in your life that's been really controlling, that starts to break something free, and that becomes an opening for healing and change.
So this, to understand all this, what kind of process did you start learning about? Like, I mean, you're working with trauma. Did it came all natural to you to understand what was going on, or was it just years of experience and seeing how these situations, I would call them, I guess, different behavior things? How did that become like your staple of understanding?
It came from both my own personal experience, like when I was describing feeling like, am I crazy because my memories don't match the family narrative? That was me many years ago, and then I also saw that dynamic playing out with many of my clients, and I realized like how, and this was before gaslighting became a buzzword. Actually, I wrote the book in 2020, it came out in 2021, 2022. Gaslighting was Merriam-Webster's word of the year. So it was like the word that was in psychology parlance, but at a very low level. And there's actually graphs you can see where they spike, like how much a word is used. It was there, but it wasn't something many people talked about. And so I think it was important to, and maybe it's talked about too much now because it's being misused, but to bring this concept forward so we can say like, oh, that's what's happening. Somebody didn't want me to know my truth because that allowed them to maintain control with their narrative. Did I get off track from your question? I feel like
No, you're kind of going through that. We're just talking about.
Yeah.
I think where I'm going is I'm trying to puzzle the two together, like your clinical work versus your experience, but also, was there any examples down the road that kind of went, aha, this is a pattern that I'm seeing, consistency? And I'm not saying everybody's the same, but there's a consistency of patterns that is identifiable, I guess. And I'm not sure if you saw that yet, because when when I was raising my children, there was definitely different patterns of three individuals. There was always a common thread that ignited them. I would, and I don't mean to jump into my personal stuff. Like the weekends, they would be at their mom's, or the week before they would be their mom's, and then on Mondays they were charged. And when I mean charged, they were like fueled with whatever that was going on the week before, and I would take 3 days to basically decompose, kind of get them back into routine. I mean that was sort of like, I knew where the common issue was, and I knew what to prepare for. But is that a consistency throughout parenting and children alike? And I'm sure adults are that way too, but I'm just trying to, I guess that's where I'm trying to figure out where that portion of your life started to figure out, wow, this is, because in your books you do talk about the steps and all that. And I really want to, and I think it kind of be a little more of the understanding how you got there is what I'm looking for.
Okay, yeah. Well, like I said, many years ago, I was in a place of depression, so I reached out to a therapist, and I wrote a little list before I came in, so I was all prepared. And one of the things I wrote down was that, like, did I say I think I'm crazy, or I doubt my memories, or something like that. That was one of the first things that I brought in there. And that came from, because, the family narrative is like, we're this good, happy Christian family, like virtual white picket fences, like lovely, lovely, lovely. And yet my experience was so much anger, there was violence. I was thrown out when I was still in high school and was a homeless teenager, and I was exposed to some really dangerous things. And there's been reconciliation and a lot of intentional relationship work between myself and members of my family. And yet the sense of like, well, I have no reason to be feeling depressed, right? Like, where would that come from? It must be biological. So it's like having to reconcile these narratives with like what I'm told and what I'm experiencing. I realistically could not move through and heal from the trauma if I held on to the story that I was expected to carry forward. And so really addressing this thing that I didn't have a name for at the time, decades ago, which was gaslighting, was an essential first step. And so as a clinician, and I often will have clients come in and be like, well, my family was great, but my family was perfect. Oh, my mom was so good. And they're stuck, and there's like these little bits that they're holding back, and that they trickle out over time. And this isn't about like finding a villain, but
Right.
really unpacking, how did your early life experiences impact you? Because that is what formed us. We are formed by our childhoods. And yeah, I think most parents do their best. But trauma is intergenerational unless we heal it. And that's why it's important that we take a look at what has harmed us and do our work so we don't pass it on to the next generation. I know both of my parents have legacies of trauma, and it makes sense that they struggled in some ways. And so having gone through my own healing work, I have compassion for that. But It doesn't come by sweeping it into the rug like gaslighting encourages us to do. It comes from directly addressing it and working through healing.
And so you're more identifiable to people that come in like that because of your own experience. And what I'm just.
I don't know, because I don't know how much like my clients about that or talk about it, or if they just find my website and like trauma therapist near me. So I didn't really talk about it in my office.
No, but I mean, and the other thing is, I love how, so we're raised in the Gen X era, and our parents are the boomer years, and then you have the World War II and basically older generation then. And I was just thinking, I was going through the historical family tree of my own, and one of the things I noticed is the generational changes in certain things. Back then, children were used as farmers, and go to get raised, do the things you need to do, and things like that. Obviously, the boomers came back from the war, and they were kind of like, or the war thing, and then all of a sudden they were trying to do other things, and we were born in that world. I mean, the thing I keep thinking back is, well, that was our generation. So our parents were our parents. They just they did the best they can. They did what they can, and
they believed the parenting philosophies of their age. It's so easy to judge their parents because they didn't do like the positive parenting or the attachment parenting that we've learned as parents to do. But that wasn't, nobody wrote those books back then.
Right.
We were raised on,
But do you think that there is that issue with the parenting of today versus the parenting in the past, where there's more attachment issues and more of that, like more helicopter mom or dad kind of like doing that versus because when we were raised, we were free and free spirit. We biked everywhere. I mean, obviously the conditions back then were completely different than they are today. But is that a pattern of just that generation shift? Like, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to be more of this, or
I think we're often very reactive. Yeah, we can be very reactive to what we were raised by and try to do the opposite. Like, I felt if somebody feels like they didn't have enough nurturance or enough attention, then they may overcompensate with, like you said, helicopter parenting, which can also be a sign of an anxious attachment, of a fear,
Yeah.
to be constantly hovering over your children and trying to, like, this also the snowplow parent idea, trying to pave the way all the time. And I think, yeah, you're right. Our generation, as parents, we are much more prone to these tendencies, and so it's good to call it out and to question it and say, like, is this exactly what I want, or am I doing this reactively? And maybe it is. Maybe this is in line with your philosophy, and maybe it's not. But the more intentional we are, the better we do.
And that's part of, obviously, so one of the things that I learned through this, well, part of your books, and I've read this type of stuff, like healthy boundaries, recognizing
Mhm.
certain things that your children are doing. And one of the things, I think I was reading it, like for example, I'll use Maya as an example. And my middle child and I were kind of like at odds, and we've had a split for a couple years.
Mhm.
And he moved to Vancouver. And one of the things that I was if we reconnected, was one of the things was to do it gentle and softly,
Mhm.
ask for
Mhm.
permission, because he has his own traumas and doing all that and kind of doing his work. And part of it is a great thing for him to do. I think it's a fabulous thing that he's living on his own, far away from everybody, to have some quiet time to reflect and understand who he is, but also have an opportunity to discover a city that I grew up in, and hang out
Mhm.
with people he didn't know growing up. So that's kind of cool. But the thing is, when we're interacting, there is tension. You can feel it. And so
Mhm.
my job as a parent is to don't press the gas, make sure you stop and hold back. And that was
Mhm.
one of the things there you said. And then, and I may paraphrase and all that, but the other thing you
Mhm.
mentioned was healthy boundaries. I
Mhm.
didn't realize how important that was
Mhm.
until after the divorce, and
Mhm.
learning about healthy boundaries and how hard. I think I learned that in 2020 during the pandemic, the importance of healthy boundaries. So those are the two things that I learned with your book and trying to apply it in my world. But describe those two situations and kind of explain how a parent is supposed to navigate in today's world without gaslighting or manipulating, or how does that work? So I'm
Yeah.
sorry, questions at one.
Yeah, another twofer.
Yeah.
What? Actually, I just wrote about boundaries. Last week I had an article on boundaries that I had published on recovered.org. And so then this week, yesterday, I released a Substack article about boundaries with a link to that as well. And then today I put out, and I don't usually do this that frequently, but today I also put out a guided meditation for my subscribers with that I recorded. That's about creating the calm and the capacity to really cultivate the kind of boundaries that are necessary, because we have a lot of mental baggage around it. Whether we're somebody who's more of an avoidant attacher who uses boundaries to keep everybody at a distance to protect ourselves, or we're an anxious person who feels threatened by boundaries or afraid that if we set them that people will be pushed too far away and we'll lose them. So we have to really do our inner work in order to set those in a healthy way, and understand really that a boundary is about creating healthy space for good relationships. It's not about, sometimes we need to set boundaries for unhealthy relationships to protect ourselves. Like if you have an ex who's really narcissistic and intrusive, you may need to have a boundary around how they can communicate with you for the sake of the kids that you share custody with, because you cannot push them out of your life because of those legal requirements. Um, and sometimes the boundary is with your best friend, and it isn't about pushing them away. It's about the same thing. The principle is protecting your emotional and physical space in a way that you can show up in a healthy way for that relationship, whether that person is your bestie or somebody you'd rather not be with, or anybody in between. So with our kids, that's an interesting question. Like we were talking about adult kids here. How do you navigate boundaries with them and giving them the space to be their own independent adults? My child is 17 and a half and graduating high school this year. And I just realized this morning that we're like 6 months away from college move-in day. And just like breaking open. And one of the things I've said to him is, you are going to have to set boundaries with me in the future, because I'm going to be wanting to be like, hey, how's school today? And hey, did you like take your meds? Or, like all up in your grill. And I'm like, I know that's not what you need as a young adult. So I know that you're going to need to negotiate that and set boundaries with me. And I hope that you know that that's welcome, even if I'll deal with my internal whatever that brings up, but that's welcome and important. So maybe just giving that permission can be helpful. And then there's the other way around. Like maybe you need to like set some boundaries with your adult child. Like, I love you and I want to hear from you. But also I go to bed at 10 or 11 or whatever time, or in your time zone, I go to bed at, 8 o'clock. So I need you to be cognizant of that and you reach out, but I really do want to connect with you. Let's just find a time that works for both of us. So that way you're not bleeding out for a relationship that you desperately want to have, but you're also taking care of yourself. Exceptions for emergencies, of course. So that's, kind of an example of what an adult boundary might look like.
So could a younger child learn these healthy boundaries without, or is it with guidance they need a little more of that? Is that, because obviously they're in school, they're not, they're not really understanding what boundary is, because everybody's kind of like doing their own thing and kind of like playing sports. They're running around all over the place. But I mean, I didn't learn healthy boundaries until years later. And I played the police officer or the ambulance driver. Like I was the rescue guy who always came in trying to rescue and always trying to do something like that. As children, we try to do that as well. We want to be the heroes and all that kind of stuff. But obviously there's a healthy line. Like, how do children understand that? How do they become aware of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Ideally, we are guiding our children to learn how to set boundaries, because there are many opportunities throughout childhood, whether it's, kind of a clingy, intrusive friend that's asking for more than your child wants, or a bully that needs to be, dealt with appropriately. One situation I see that comes up often with my teenage clients is losing sleep because one of their friends is suicidal and is texting them all night, and they feel like, I can't not respond because they might die and that's on me. And so you can see, like, as a parent, like, that's way too much of an emotional burden for my teenager to carry, right? You wouldn't want that for your kid. And like, you can also understand as a teenager how intense that would feel. And so that's like a situation where they could really use some adult guidance to figure out, like, how do I care for my friend and protect my emotional space? Because then these kids are the ones who end up in therapy because they're so anxious and distressed and not getting enough sleep, so they're just emotionally deteriorating as a result. So there is a healthy place where it's like, this is where I'm going to bring my boundaries. I'm going to bring in an adult to help you because this is too much for me. Or I care about you and I want to spend time with you, but I can only do in these times. But if you're really truly feeling suicidal, I'm going to call your mom, or I need you to call a hotline, or something, like figuring all those things out, which are tough for a teenager. And so all of that is part of figuring out how you're allowed to prioritize yourself, which really, okay, the foundation of it to make it okay to set boundaries is knowing that you deserve it. So it comes a little piece of that self-love that says, my needs matter too. Their needs matter. I care about them, but mine also do. And I'm going to love myself in action by setting boundaries, at least in non-emergency situations.
Right. So I know when I set the boundary initially with my middle child, it was an incident that he did that was beyond, it was gaslighting. Like he was just replicating what his mother was teaching him how to do. And he just did what he needed to do. And it cost some things. And obviously we went to therapy and we had a discussion. And one of the things I asked for him was to apologize. And he said, I don't know anything about it. But the thing that I said to him at the time is I love you no matter what. But until that happens, we can't move past this, because I need that apology, because it shows you are responsible for it. Obviously he denied, deflect, accused other people, which was wrong. I mean, 100%. But as years passed, he learned about my condition and he reached out and he said, "Hey,
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure you're okay." And that's how the conversation went. And my thing is that's where I didn't bring the past up. I just let it be.
Mm-hmm.
This is not the time to have those discussions. So like in that situation, when you've done the healthy boundary, they reached out, they said something, and I'm just using me as an example because I don't know if other family members are out there like this similar. What's the course for an individual if they're having those issues with their children? They have to set some boundaries, like a father or a mother who are in a very co-parenting toxic situation. What's the I'll put my plan together. My plan is to kind of let it go for a while and see where it goes, and not putting stress on the relationship, and hopefully we can talk about it down the road. Is that a good strategy in that situation?
Yeah, I really do agree that unless something is acknowledged, you really can't move beyond it. I found that in my personal relationships, and sometimes it takes years or even decades for that to come. That doesn't mean there has to be an estrangement necessarily. It depends on the scenario, you know. There's people who have been molested by their own parent, and there's no acknowledgement of that. I
Wow.
understand estrangement then, right?
Yeah.
Forever. It's a very personal choice. Other things sometimes, you know, a lot of times lack of apology and acknowledgement really comes from a poor ego strength and a fear of a pattern of being punished whenever there's wrongdoing. So there's a sense of like, I can't admit I'm bad because a bad thing will happen on a subconscious level. And it's interesting because it sounds like time passed, your son's maturing, and then he's able to reach out to you.
Right.
So I think on some level, when those conversations don't happen, it does impair the relationship. You're not capable of having that next level growth of closeness, and that's something that's sad, but it doesn't mean that you cannot have any kind of relationship.
Mm.
And so I think what you're doing seems very wise, and maybe it's something you revisit at some point when the time feels right. If the communication
Right.
and relationship continues to build and grow, that you might revisit and say like, "Hey, you know, that conversation we had in therapy, are you willing to revisit that conversation with me? Because I feel like it's not fully settled between us."
Right. You actually bring up another point that I didn't think of. You know, when a child is obviously harmed one way or another, and they decide to basically, well, there is a new trend going on, is no contact.
There's a lot
Is
happening.
it's happening on TikTok, like
Mhm,
everybody's doing non-contact and all this stuff. What's I mean, first off, I do understand if there is a child that was somehow or another happened to them during their period of growth there,
mhm,
that the new no contact obviously makes sense because
mhm.
you need to stay away from people that are harmful. But this trend of no contact, what damage are we doing with our family nucleus?
Yeah, I think it's a concerning trend to keep an eye on, and I've even had some, like, self-questioning with, you know, because in my gaslighting book, I talk about boundaries, I talk about making decisions about keeping people in your life, or if you need to make a
Yeah.
clean cut. I'm like, "Gosh, have I contributed to this, like, epidemic of family rupture?" But I do think, like, there's nuances there, and in fact, there's also a decision tree handout that I also used to have on my website, but may or may not be there right now, as a download, but I can also send that to anybody who wants it, because it's not a one size fits all.
Right.
And what I think is happening right now with what we have with social media, especially social media influencers, is you've got, you know, 60 seconds of somebody departing their so-called wisdom, rather than an in-depth exploration of your dynamics like you might have in therapy, which is very nuanced. So you've got a one size fits all answer. You know, and buzzwords like toxic thrown out. So is your mom toxic? Cut her out of your life. Well, what does that mean? Let's unpack that. You know, is she perfect? No, I can guarantee your mom is not perfect no matter what. Like nobody's is. Um, is she willing to work on things? Are you able to have conversations? What I think is happening is that people actually are substituting emotional depth, emotional maturity for quick fixes that make them feel empowered. And so there's a sense of, look how strong I am without having this person in my life, by making these clean cuts that demonstrates that I am actually more emotionally mature. But it may actually be a substitute for doing the harder work, which is working through conflict, working toward reconciliation, or navigating boundaries within an imperfect dynamic. Now, all that to say, there's no one size fits all. Some people really do need to remove or greatly reduce contact with a parental figure in order to be emotionally healthy, or they might need to take a time out. Like, nothing has to be forever.
Right.
I had a period of time where I did not have contact with my parents, as I was starting to open up some of the things that had happened, and circled back a year later and started to have conversations. And that was actually really healthy for me, and I think for our dynamic. But I'm grateful that we've done that hard work, even though it took a very long time and at different paces with different parents.
So
My
can I just ask you a quick question? How is your parents and you are in a better place today than you were before? Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah, and I think contrary to what a lot of people gut level think,
Yeah.
talking directly about the hard stuff made it better, rather than just pretending everything was fine, where you're all clenched up inside feeling irritated and angry because you're being gaslit the whole time. I don't have space for gaslighting, and I made that very clear and very consistent. Like, I'm not going to accept a false narrative. So unless we're honest about what happened, like, there's just not going to be a dialogue. My story's not everybody's. Everybody has a different dynamic with their parent or their whoever is the important person in their life they're thinking about right now as they're listening. And some people are more amenable to change, and some people are really narcissistic and really not open to considering any kind of change or any kind of dialogue. But you ask, like, what are we losing when we do this? Sometimes we're losing the stress that it was carrying in a really, really unhealthy place. But sometimes we're also losing what could be, in some ways, a support system, because people are not black and white. We want black and white solutions because it makes life easy. But the reality is, we all have good and bad mixed up inside of us. Some have more bad than others. And our parents are the same. And so the question is there something here you want to hold on to? And you don't have to throw them away out of some sense of proving yourself or moral purity or achieving enlightenment of some kind of spiritual guru-ness. And you may.
Yeah. No, that's so actually I was reading something today, and it had to do with about not being perfect, and we're talking about. And what it was is the what I was reading was, we all make a promise to ourselves, especially in a trauma situation or in a situation where we say we're going to get out of here, we're going to make a difference, and we have this false narrative in our lives that we kind of just, and this is what I understand what I was reading today. So, but from what I was thinking, like, it comes from the childhood, like whatever was happening in our childhood, we had this thing in our perception where we said, okay, this is, I'm going to get richer. I'm going to have a better relationship. I'm going to have this. I'm going to have that. But then all that runs out, and none of it becomes true. We're holding it, kind of like, it was like a holding pattern what I was understanding was, it was like you're in a holding pattern of the what ifs, and you're not really living your life. You're not taking a moment to live within and understand what was going on. And I think that's what happens with most of our society. We just kind of have this, like, things weren't great in our childhood, so we're going to make changes in our adult life and run. And then we realize, well, I realized when I was my 50s that wasn't the right way to do it. And and obviously there was a lot of things comes with that, a lot of self-awareness and all that things. But I think I just don't know how, like, there's a lot of individuals sitting out there just kind of like stuck in this in between world of reality and fantasy, I guess is the best way to put it. And they're not coming to the grips of how, that world does not exist. How does a person understand that, because I think it's a trend now. I think I'm seeing more of that type of discussion out there. Obviously, I don't know why it's out there, but that's sort of like the trend now. Is that something you're seeing in your practice, or is that what most people are feeling, the in between?
I don't know if I fully understood your question, so let
That's
me
not
give it a
fine.
try.
Yeah.
But, so you're talking about when somebody has had visions for their life, like, "I'm gonna grow up and be an astronaut," or something like that, and that doesn't come to fruition? Or are you talking
No, it's
different
this
things?
yes, I'm sorry. So if when you're like, for me, when I was growing up, I thought, I always want to bet, I want another parents. Like, I always want something different,
Mhm.
always wishing something different. And what happened was, obviously, that wasn't true. And then I said to myself, I'm just going to use me as an example. So, and I said, well, I'm going to make more money. So I went and make more money. And that didn't happen. That didn't satisfy my ego or my, what I was
Mm,
feeling. And I think there's a lot of individuals that do that, and not a career wise, like they might jump into careers and then all of a sudden they say that's not their career anymore. They go jump something else. I
mhm,
think there is, and I'm sorry if I'm not explaining this correctly, but one of the things I think is that we live in this world that we're in between, even though we're trying to achieve things, but it's kind of like holding us back to achieve the things that we want. So it's almost that
mm,
it's almost like we're trying to do what we want to do, but the past is holding us back, and somehow or another we're not able to let go of that world, and
mhm.
it's affecting our current world. We're in that in between.
Yeah. So, like, for example, the beliefs and our self-limiting beliefs that we gathered up throughout childhood hold us back, from really achieving our dreams. I know I can relate to that. Like, I've had certain opportunities along my writing career where, I get close to success and then I start, like when I first had a few agents I pitched, said, like, send me your proposal. And then I didn't send it. I have an agent now, but this is part of my story in getting there. Like I get close and then I'm like, yeah, who am I to be successful? Or what would happen if I got like famous and people would know me and what if my family didn't approve and all these fears, but it's kind of this unworthiness belief kind of beneath it maybe. um for example, like everybody has their own self-sabotaging beliefs, but I think that probably is not unique to me to like get close and then pull ourselves back. And I think a lot of times people who are really successful in their careers are people with less emotional baggage because they have that confidence, then and less of the self-limiting beliefs driving the ship. Is that kind of what you're asking about?
Yeah, so basically, yeah, because that affects your relationships, that affects your
Mhm,
the way you grow. I mean,
mhm,
that's the point that was, sorry for the long-winded explanation, but exactly, that is the issue with most of us, and I think it caused me to, where I understand what you're saying, like, sometimes I didn't feel that I deserved it, or I don't deserve the right relationship, or I don't have
mhm.
this, and I think a lot of us are struggling with that.
And we
Um
might have a negative belief, like these core schemas that are formed in childhood.
Right,
Like, people will leave me, people will abandon me because it's happened in some form before. And so you get into a relationship and then you become really clingy or something.
yeah,
And that
exactly.
sabotages the relationship and makes the self-fulfilling belief come true, even though your goal was to have a successful, safe, secure, loving relationship. So you
Correct,
drive away the very thing you want because of these underlying beliefs.
and that comes from your childhood, so how does a person get through that? Is it just more of self-aware or spending time alone? I mean, for me, what happened was I sat alone and I spent the entire COVID in one bedroom apartment just by
Wow.
myself.
Wow.
And that was probably a I call it the best medicine anybody can give me. And and so and I guess that's where I think a lot of people don't spend a lot of time alone and understanding who they are and kind
Mm.
of go through that work. They just jump from one to another. How
Yeah, we
dangerous is
fill
that?
all. Yeah, it keeps you stuck. It keeps
Yeah.
you stuck, and so it costs you all of what could be. We so often, like you said, we don't want to sit with our feelings. It's painful. It brings up anxieties with food, with drinking, with pot, with scrolling. Oh my goodness, like it's so easy now. Like even on the platforms that we share, like I'm just going to read,
Yeah.
there's so many easy, accessible addictions to keep us from stopping and thinking, to just sit with those thoughts. And like you said, sitting with yourself for a big period of time is uncomfortable, but so important to really sit and explore. And maybe if just sitting is too hard, journaling, asking yourself the questions like, what am I afraid of? Who do I think I am? Like,
Yeah.
what are my self-limiting beliefs? Really just journaling until they come out to the surface, asking yourself those questions in different ways. Of course, I'm going to say the help of a therapist can be really, really helpful. I know it's kind of a plug for the industry, but that's not accessible to everybody. And so I'm really glad you're asking the question the way that you are. Like, what can we do outside of therapy
Yeah.
for people who might not have that access or that affordability? Sometimes there's, reading a self-help book can be a way to kind of guide some of those questions, structure some of those questions, but really like journaling, writing can be one of those powerful ways to really get at what is your subconscious holding on to that's holding you back. You can also look at what are some of your core memories, because emotion is what encodes memory in the brain. So we tend to remember our exciting, but also our hardest memories the longest. So what are some of those earliest memories when we're just barely forming the ability to form memory? And what does that say? What did that tell you about the world? Right? Like one of my earliest memories was being bad and having to stay home from an outing. So like there's a core belief about yourself, right? I am bad and I'm going to be excluded, right? So it's just a little memory of me like looking out of the screen door and crying. But I'm like, well, what does that tell me about myself? So I had to like sit and think through that. And then that I don't have to hold on to that anymore. I can release that and be like, okay, that's a 2 or 3-year-old's interpretation of the world.
Right.
I don't have to hold on to that in my 40s.
So letting go, letting go is hard.
It is.
It's not an easy process at all.
No.
It's almost like wow.
It takes having compassion for that little part, that little child in the memory who was 3 or 4 or 7 or whatever age, and saying like, even just kind of like closing your eyes and talking to that little part, like, sweetie, you're not bad,
right.
or whatever the belief or the feeling about that came up in the memory is. Like, you are worthy of attention or care, or maybe it was being humiliated in school when you were called on and you didn't know what to say. And it's like, little John, you're smart. It's okay that you got tongue tied sometimes, or whatever that, I'm just making this up. It's not something John has shared with me. But like, whatever.
Just make it up.
Yeah. I don't think I'm smart. I don't. No, but whatever those hard memories are, like figuring out what was the negative thing that I held in about that, and how can I speak some loving, kind truth to that part of me, and let that soften.
So you hit the most important thing: journaling and writing. And when you're talking to your younger self, when I write, I'm actually talking to my younger self. That makes sense. Like I'm talking to that person that is trying to heal a lot of the pains that I went through. But what does that really psychologically do for somebody who actually sits and writes out their pain and their I actually read a person that wrote out of passion and just spent one night just writing it out and just felt good after it. Like, what does that do to somebody who actually spends time writing or even doodling or painting? What does that help, like psychologically? How does that help somebody?
Well, these artistic practices, especially, and I want to say when you're writing by hand, especially, versus typing on the computer, taps into your more emotive, obviously creative part of the brain. And so what we often do is we try to logic our way out of our problems. We analyze it, we rationalize it. When we talk, we're usually more in touch with our analytical part of our brain. But when we get into these artistic modes, like you said, doodling or painting or handwriting, journaling, free flow, free association without what's the word, like self-editing as you go along.
Yeah.
Then we're going into a real emotive part. And when we can allow ourselves to do that, then we can release some of those emotions that we've held bottled up so long, telling ourselves that, well, it's over, so we don't need to think about that anymore, or you should know better, or, well, like, that's not important right now. But the problem is often we bottle things up when we're young because we don't have the skills, the understanding, the support of people, whatever, to make sense of it. So we just shove it down for years and years and it doesn't go away just because it's inside. It's kind of like putting something in your closet, closing the door. It doesn't disappear. It's still in your closet. That's
Right.
what we often do. So we need to find ways to work it through, to bring it up into the light, and then just kind of like gently release it.
Yeah. So yeah. So when I started doing that, like I always wrote in journals, and it was like mostly like a manifestation type of journal.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I actually during the COVID, when I actually sat down and I started writing, that actually triggered something that I wasn't expecting, and that actually changed the way I thought and all the things, and I actually started creating some closures to some of the things that I might have felt it wasn't able to close, right? So my writing helped me close some of those doors. And now today, my writing just it's more or less of me just like I'm writing about my pulmonary clot thing.
Yeah, that's so scary.
And I'm writing about that, and for me, it's to process what's going on, how to put it on paper, and just kind of like releasing it and saying, okay, I'm letting it go to the world, and it is what it is. That's what Substack has done for me. It was like I'm releasing it out there, and then anybody is whatever happens out there happens out there. I'm okay with it.
It takes a lot of courage to put ourselves out there, I think, like that, especially when you're writing self-reflective personal pieces.
Right. It's hard. I mean, don't get me wrong. The first couple times putting it out there was the challenge, and I'm sure that you probably feel the same way. That was probably when you're putting out your stuff out there.
Mm-hmm.
That is hard. Yeah, I'm just trying to like what I mean. If you're writing today with all your knowledge and all the things you got going on, what's the one thing you would tell somebody how to, what would be the thing you tell somebody about this therapeutical way of being artistic? What would be the first thing you would say? Just how would you start? What would be the thing you would suggest?
For most people, I would give this as a suggestion. This is not a rule, but separate out healing writing from publishing writing. And then the healing writing, the writing you're doing for your healing, can become publishing writing. But if you're thinking through the lens of what is everybody going to think as they write this, you're going to self-edit yourself. So to really get some like therapeutic benefit, it needs to be like handwrite it in a journal. Later, if you want to transcribe bits of it or rewrite it to share, that can be very powerful. And I think sharing our stories can be really healing to each other, because when we see ourselves in others, we get the sense that we're not alone. And that's one of the biggest lies of trauma, is we feel universally alone. Whether you've been part of a mass shooting where there's multiple survivors right there with you, everyone I worked with who's been in a mass shooting is like, feels alone. Or you've been a survivor of sexual molestation or assault. That's 1 in 3 of us as women and like 1 in 6 men. And yet the sense of, I'm damaged, I'm alone, right? So sharing your story actually is really powerful for other people to be like, oh, yes, that resonates. Thank you for putting words to my experience. But you don't have to do that. And there's a great saying that they use in kind of the memoir world that I love, which is write from the scar, not the wound. In other words, when it scars over, like when it feels a sense of healing, like, yeah, you're always changed. There's that scar there. But don't just put the wound out there, because if you're feeling really vulnerable about it, you're probably not prepared for whatever kind of feedback you might get. Like, hopefully there's nice stuff, but you don't know what you're going to get. When you're feeling healed and grounded, then you're in more of a place where you can receive whatever people might want to share, or maybe you just close comments if you're writing on a platform. But separate out the two: one for healing, one for that next phase.
And that's important to understand, that the difference between both. When you're writing for your healing, you're not writing for anybody else other than yourself. And
yeah, say all the ugly stuff, the stuff you're ashamed of. Put those into words, knowing that nobody ever has to see.
and nobody has to see them, but also it's for your inner child. Your inner child is actually seeping out, asking for that stuff. So
needing to
that's
be
pretty
present.
cool.
Mm.
Yeah. So in that situation, when you're writing for yourself, obviously the creativity and all that, one of the things that I've learned is that was the best part of it was I started to understand my creativity.
Mm. Mhm.
It was a tool that I didn't have before. So I started to understand it, and that was probably part of it. And I don't think, and most people understand that when they're fully writing on a regular basis, they're doing it as a way to understand, but also a way to release some of the things that they're thinking about.
Yeah,
So,
there's a whole school of thought, like there's different therapeutic schools of thought, ways we approach therapy, and one is narrative therapy. And it's based on the concept that the stories we tell about the events in our lives, the narratives we attach to events, shape how we feel. And so we can shape our lives somewhat through creating that narrative. And I think writing is really acting out those principles. You're kind of doing your own narrative therapy. Because when you tell a story, you put a frame on it, right?
right.
It's maybe it's a victimhood or survivor one, or what stories you decide to include are what feels like that shaping you and your narrative. So
Mhm.
yeah.
That's pretty cool. So what's the one thing that you would suggest? Oh, I want to ask you one more question.
Yeah.
Um, what about close? Like, obviously, writing could be a closure, right? In some ways,
Hmm.
like, what else is there? Anything else you can suggest about closing your past? Like, is there any way to kind of like? Is there anything like that that you can say? This is what you should be working on.
Yeah, actually, I think rituals and routines around closure and grief are so important. Um, the thing that popped to mind when you said that is something my little high school best friend and I did at like 14 years old or 15 years old, and I still think it's actually a pretty helpful idea. When some boy broke our heart either by not paying attention or there was a breakup, we take all the letters we'd written to each other, or we'd write something about them, and we would burn it in her driveway in the dirt. Let it go up in the ashes. And it's interesting how much fire is used in spiritual rituals and I think practices throughout the world, but there is something to that, to like first externalizing it, and then letting it go. Um, I remember once when I worked in the group homes way back with one little boy, he would write out his angry thoughts or his secrets or whatever, and we would put it through the shredder, which is not nearly as magical as fire, but like you don't always want emotionally disturbed children playing
You
with
have
fire. So
parameters to it. You have restrictions.
but
Fire
there's something to that, ripping it up in little pieces, or finding a way to just be like, and that is done, and I'm not even going to hold on to this writing. And that's a choice. Um, Rituals around grieving, understanding that grief is not just when somebody dies, but it's loss, right? So we seem to understand that when somebody dies, it's good to hold some kind of a memorial or funeral process to release and say goodbye and honor our memories. Um, Sometimes we need to do that with a chapter of our life, or maybe a marriage that ended not through death, but through dissolution. And there may be good that you mourn while you're also angry or glad about other parts that are no longer messing with your life. Give yourself permission to grieve the good that is no longer there.
Actually, I got to tell you this. So we're in therapy, and she asked us, "So what's the one good thing?" Because this is prime example of what she was trying to do. What's the one good thing you could talk about her, and what's the one good thing about him? And we couldn't come up with a good thing.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. Oh man, that's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. But later in life, I realized when I was dealing with some of my health issues, um, one of the things I appreciated what she did was she was an advocate, and she
Mm,
how to be an advocate in the medical world and not just sit back and just take on whatever. A prime example of her teaching me that was when I was in the hospital. I said, you said I was coming here for a specialist, and you didn't give me a specialist. You gave me a
mm.
general doctor. I want the specialist. So I mean,
Definitely miss that might have been a problem at home really helped in settings.
but the thing is, I would never have said anything. I would just
Yeah.
I would have gone with the flow, get me out of here. and she taught me about stuff like that. So that's one good thing that I,
Yeah.
years later, that I
Well,
did appreciate.
when we're really like we're dealing with a breakup or things are acute, we don't really usually want to let in the good or to acknowledge it because that just makes it harder, right? To admit that something is over and there's good and to have to also then face grief on top of, adjusting to life separate. So when you've got more emotional space and more emotional maturity to be able to say like, this person wasn't all bad. She wasn't evil. That that is real emotional maturity in that, and it actually helps you to be able to not harbor quite as much bitterness when you can also say, all right, well, I'll hold on to this good little bit.
Well, what I've done to close that out was basically say we did what we did.
Mm-hmm.
There's no good or bad in this situation. We just failed at being a partner, and
Mm-hmm.
that's really no one's fault. And
Mm-hmm.
it is what it is. How it ended and how it went on, that's a different story. But we were both contributing to that. I can't blame her. She can't blame me. It's just, it is what it is. So
Mm-hmm.
when people kind of like say, how do I close things out? For me, you got to have to look at it internally and say, what responsibilities are you willing to take as part of that situation? Because, as a kid, I was growing up, we had, grew up in an Italian family and the old school type things where the slippers would come at you, the
Mm-hmm.
belt would come at you, you learn a couple things. And I remember my son asking me, did you get whipped by a belt? And, that's wrong. Or, you should be calling child services when you're young. And I was like, hey man, just take the number, just hit it and just move on. You just take the lickings and you move it on.
And
That's the,
like we said earlier about like cultural shifts through time, nobody would have come probably, right?
no.
So
So, well, let's talk about your books and where they can get them. I'll make sure I'll put a link in the bottom. So this is one of her books that it talks about what we've been talking about in
it's the
generality.
Gaslighting Step-by-Step Recovery Guide.
Yeah. And then this one is a trauma recovery for your teenagers, right?
Yep, the Trauma Recovery Workbook for Teens.
And if they get these books, what's expected out of all of it? It's just a better understanding what gaslighting means, or
Yeah, so the gaslighting book, it's kind of in two sections. The first section is about 3 chapters, and it talks about what gaslighting is and where that came from. What are some of the tactics of gaslighters? What are some of the cycles of relationship with a gaslighter? And so it really helps you to build an understanding of what's going on in your life. Or if you get through those 3 chapters and you're like, that was not in my life, and the book's probably not for you. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And then the last section is 7 more chapters, and it walks you through 7 healing steps to overcoming the emotional abuse you experienced in life with a gaslighter, all the way from recognition and acceptance, not that it was okay, but that it happened as a reality, to grieving those losses, developing self-care and self-love, toward developing boundaries, making decisions about the relationship, and then even how to cultivate healthy relationships in the future, because it's not enough just to leave and overcome that pain, but we also really want to move into flourishing. So that's the gaslighting one. And the Trauma Recovery Workbook is 6 sections, and it walks you through, there it is again on the screen. It just walks teenagers through understanding trauma and different stages of healing, and then cultivating resilience and moving toward post-traumatic growth. And that one is just full of exercises, activities, meditations, checklists. It's very interactive and colorful. And a question I get a lot is, okay, but this is just for teenagers. And when it first came out, I think it was like a pre-release copies. A friend of mine who runs a group therapy practice nearby had all of her clinicians read it. And she said they'd come back to her and say, but I'm using this on me. Is that okay? And I'm like, yes, of course it's okay. Because the reality is,
that's what I started using for. I was using this for me too. I was like, what is
the
one?
principles are the same.
And then the accepting, what's that? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you.
Oh, you're
I just said like the prince. Is it not working? The principles are the same.
Cutting in and out. I'm sorry. Yes.
Oh no.
Gotcha. No, I hear you now.
Yeah.
I hear you now.
Okay. I think
Yeah.
we got out of synchronization. But yeah, the principles are the same regardless of, it's written at a reading level that it's accessible to teenagers with examples that are drawn from younger people's lives, which for many of us is when our biggest traumas happen, but not for everybody. So
Yeah, these are very easy reads, a better understanding of stuff. Creating boundaries is really important part. The gaslighting, understanding gaslighting, how does that work? Because we're seeing that more and more in our lives, especially through the fabric of our society, and really how to overcome it and how do you better prepare yourself for what's coming. And it also helps you understand where other people are coming from too. So uh, Deborah, hey man, thank you very much. The one thing how you could tell we're another Canadian, how you know you're talking to another Canadian, it's the about. I don't think we can ever get away from that. So
yeah, and it's always stronger right after a trip home, and then people are like, "Wait, are you Canadian?" And I'm like, "Why, yes, thanks for noticing."
how can our audience get a hold of you if they haven't
Um,
decided already?
yeah, so my primary website is drdeborahvinall.com. That's DRDEBORAH VINALL. Oh, my name's on the screen, so it's exactly what it says on the screen, but without the dot. .com. And you can follow me on Substack. I release weekly writing that's free to all subscribers, and my handle there is just dvinall at Substack, and it's titled Mental Health Musings if you just want to search for that. I'm on all the platforms. All the links to that are on my website. So probably the easiest thing is just to go to the website if you're interested in specifically like Instagram or TikTok or something like that. But yeah, I'd love to have you join me on Substack where we can have a dialogue about your mental health. And if you grab a book, drop me a review. I read them all.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you for everybody joining. 100% appreciate you guys being here. And